Great literature is not confined to just one language. All over the world, authors from diverse cultures and backgrounds are writing amazing stories in a variety of languages. Luckily, there is a thriving translation industry willing and able to help spread these works to the English reading world. However, translation is a complicated process, and not all translations are created equally. There are many ways to translate a book, and different translators may have different goals and thought processes. And before long, we may even have translations completely done by artificial intelligence. Some feel like a good translation is one that captures the same feeling as the original text and can stand on its own as a novel. The perfect example of this type of translation is 100 Years of Solitude. Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote the novel in Spanish, and it was first published in 1967. The story follows 7 generations of one Latin American family from the 1820s to the 1920s, and is celebrated as a classic piece of Latin American literature and a masterful work highlighting the author's signature style of magical realism. When Cien Años de Soledad was translated into English by Gregory Rabassa in 1970, Rabassa faced a choice with how he translated some elements. In some areas, he restrained himself to domestication, but in other places, he added additional context for the English-reading audience. In every translation, there's the question of domesticating versus foreignizing. A type of domesticating would be changing words to an equivalent in another language, or foreignizing would be keeping them the same. For example, in the Bible, the names John, Matthew, and Paul become Juan, Mateo, and Pablo in the Spanish version. Rabassa kept the names in 100 Years of Solitude the same, which would be foreignizing, but that resulted in some areas where the English audience requires extra information to fully understand the context. In this example, Rabassa adds that carnicero means butcher in Spanish, something that the Spanish readers would already know, but non-Spanish readers might not. And since the name informs the characterization, it keeps the audience on the same level between translations. This is just one of the many creative decisions that made 100 Years of Solitude a beloved novel in both languages. Even Marquez says that the English version stands on its own as a work of art, separate from the original. Both versions are available from Gwinnett County Public Libraries if you want to make your own comparisons. While the term translation implies a direct adaptation from one language to another, that is not always the case. When Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem was translated from its original Chinese to English, he worked with the translator Ken Liu, who is a respected science fiction author in his own right. The story of The Three-Body Problem portrays a fictional past, present, and future where Earth encounters an alien civilization in a nearby star system that consists of 3 suns orbiting each other in an unstable three-body system. While Ken Liu was working on his translation of The Three-Body Problem, he thought that the story could be improved by some reorganization. Chronologically, the story starts in the 1960s with the Chinese Cultural Revolution. When the story was originally being published chapter by chapter, Liu Cixin worried that the Chinese government censors wouldn't allow him to talk negatively about the Cultural Revolution. As a result, the story starts in the present day, and the Cultural Revolution chapters in that era are flashbacks hidden in the middle of the book. In a bold move, Ken Liu actually suggested that the Cultural Revolution scenes be moved back to the beginning of the book, and Liu Cixin agreed. So the author's intended chapter order was restored in the English translation. Liu Cixin even recommends that English-reading Chinese fans read the translated version rather than the Chinese version. Translators of contemporary literature may have the luxury of working with the original authors, but what about if the book came out over 100 years ago? Or what if you had no way of even reaching the author because they lived on the other side of the world? Les Miserables has had its fair share of translations since it was first published in French in 1862, each with their own peculiarities and problems. The first English translation was done by Charles Wilbur the same year, and for the most part it has stood the test of time. It is a faithful translation, with its main drawback being the antiquated English. Most translations use the Wilbur version as a base and just modernize some of the language. If you've ever seen an abridged version of Les Mis, it's most likely based off the Wilbur translation. That includes a strange edition published during the Civil War for the Confederacy by a translator only known as A.F. Along with cutting a lot of the essays out, they also removed the anti-slavery messaging, which demonstrates how translators are not a monolith. They can very easily transform the meaning of a text through their personal touch, intentionally or not. Fyodor Dostoevsky's seminal work, Crime and Punishment, has been translated over a dozen times in English alone, and each translator has had their own interpretation of the iconic Russian novel. While not the first, Constant Garnett's translation has been the de facto English version for over 100 years. though many other translators have tried their hand at correcting the issues with Garnett's version. For example, Garnett has admitted to rushing her work and altering difficult passages to ease her workload rather than serve the translation. Many Russian critics claim that Garnett is responsible for homogenizing the writing styles of the Russian authors she translated. Russian exile and former United States Poet Laureate Joseph Brodsky said this about her. The reason English readers can barely tell the difference between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky is that they aren't reading the prose of either one. They're reading Constance Garnett. The Garnett translation still has its loyal supporters, and her version has endured over 100 years and survived a dozen newer translations, which means every translation is different, and part of the fun is discovering what you like. The quote-unquote best translation is the one you like the most. If you want to try your hand at translating a book yourself, Gwinnett County Public Library has a collection of books for all ages written in Spanish, French, Chinese, Korean, and many other languages. And if all this translation talk has inspired you to learn a new language, the library has many language learning resources. We have programs and clubs for learning a variety of languages like Spanish, Korean, and French, a variety of books, audiobooks, and videos, and access to the Mango Languages app.